absolutely. And you mentioned some of the guys pouncing on him. Rosie Greer, one former football player. They really had focused everything on Sirhan, and yet there was another shooter. And Dr. Noguchi did a fabulous job on this autopsy. It was not messed up and botched like the JFK assassination.
The autopsy, in fact, in another book, it was a series I used to do called Legal Medicine Annual. I had, as one of the chapters, I called it A Study in Contrast. And that's all I did after a brief introduction was to set forth word for word with no editorializing at all. I just set forth the John F. Kennedy autopsy by the two pathologists, Humes and Boswell, who had performed that postmortem examination and who had no forensic pathology experience whatsoever. I juxtaposed that with the autopsy by Tom Noguchi in the Robert F. Kennedy case, and I called it A Study in Contrast. Day and night. It's a McDonald's hamburger compared to a steak at Ruth's Chris or Morton's Steakhouse. I mean, there's just no comparison. And can you believe that in the one case with John F. Kennedy, they called in people who have had no experience whatsoever to do an autopsy on the president of our country, who was dead of multiple gunshot wounds, with all kinds of determinations to be made, correlations with John Connolly's wounds, etc. And then in the Robert F. Kennedy case, they have a sterling autopsy performed, and it is completely ignored, and it has been ignored since 1968. And you cannot get this case reopened. And one other thing, you see, that has to be kept in mind. What I said, people say, well, the Kennedys are so... that you got to remember this: the Kennedy family has to want it to be done, just like the family of Mr. X, Y, and Z, or A, B, and C want to have something done. And I've done these kinds of second autopsies and exhumation autopsies dozens of times over the 47 years in which I've been involved in this business. And it's done when you go to court and you present your evidence and so on. But the family has got to be behind it. When the family doesn't want it, and especially if the family is the Kennedy family, then forget about it. Kiss it goodbye. It's not going to happen.
Possibility maybe Kennedys, for one reason or another, do not want this open? That
I can't answer. That is a mystery. That you'll have to talk to a psychiatrist about. I'm a lifelong Democrat. And I voted for John Kennedy, and I've had the pleasure of meeting Ted Kennedy personally when I was the chairman of the party here. Invited him in, and I was consulted in the Kopechne case and so on. But so I don't want anybody to think I'm dumping on the Kennedys. But the truth must be told, and all the truth must be laid out. And people. I want to let everybody be as bewildered as I am.
Doctor, I had a question for you. Doctor,
go ahead.
If you can hear me.
Yeah.
I had a question
I hear
for you.
Yes.
Now, I've got a book in front of me called Robert F. Kennedy Assassination by Philip H. Melanson, Ph.D.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Excellent book.
Excellent.
Dr. Philip Melanson is a friend of mine, regrettably died some years ago, still a young man, and I worked with him, University in Massachusetts. I forget which university, but in Massachusetts, it was at Amherst and he wrote an excellent book, and that I recommend that book to anybody who wants to learn more about the Robert F. Kennedy case.
And I read the book, sir. That's one of the books that I based my questions on here to talk about this with Joe. Is that what are your thoughts about the Central Intelligence Agency during the 1950s and 60s with experiments with LSD and mind control hypnosis, things of that nature? What are your thoughts about that? And obviously in one of the chapters here it talks about that specifically.
Well, there's no question about the CIA having been engaged in those kinds of experiments. That's documented. Remember the guy that flew out of the window in New York? I forget his name right now. There was a big lawsuit there. They were experimenting with LSD and with other drugs. Oh, they were heavy into that.
Right.
There's no question. Remember, they were going to do, they were trying to do everything, poison Castro, and so on. They were running amok, killing this one here, Allende in Chile, the Young brothers in Vietnam.
Right.
Anywhere, Mossadegh, anywhere you wanted the government overturned, the CIA was ready to oblige you. I can't say. I just don't know. Not because I'm afraid to express myself.
Right.
I have no evidence that the CIA
and experimenting on Americans. They did that. They were actually using these tools against their own people, and that's what I'm trying to get into. Is that this book actually says, the one by Melanson, is that Sirhan was the so-called Manchurian candidate, and I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, he may well have been. I think that the overall impressions that one walks away with when you read and study this case, and you learn more about Sirhan, and you read his own statements and comments thereafter, and so on, that he seems to fit the bill for someone who was under a hypnotic influence. I think there's a strong case that can be made for that. Now, who put him under that hypnosis and who directed him, I just don't know. Could it have been the CIA? Certainly. Let me make it clear. I do not consider them to have been an agency of innocence and benign behavior. And as a matter of fact, I think that they may well have played a role to some extent with John F. Kennedy. I think that the Kennedys represented a force that was simply antithetical to the CIA's beliefs in terms of national and, more importantly, international politics. And the only way to defeat the Kennedys was to kill them.
It's unbelievable. Great point, too. We're down to our last few minutes, but, Sarah, we're talking about cause of death. We've also talked about the other books by Sarah Reck. I suggest everybody get out and read those. They're fabulous books. But we talk about the different things that went on just prior to Robert Kennedy's death. And Pierre Salinger, who you probably know knew of very well, personal friend and, of course, an advisor to JFK. Robert F. Kennedy was known to have told him, I figured out what happened to my brother, and after I'm elected president, I am going to bring it, and it is going to blow it wide open. Could that, do you believe that, and could that have caused maybe his untimely death?
Yes, it has been documented that Robert Kennedy did say privately to a couple of people that he was going to get into the case. He knew that he couldn't do so as long as Lyndon Johnson was president and J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI, because those were his two bitter enemies. And there was no way in the world that he could have gotten anything from them. You or I, or a beggar walking off the streets of Washington, D.C. would have received a warmer reception from those two people than Robert Kennedy would have. So does that then fit in with what happened to Robert Kennedy? You're darn right it does fit in. Admittedly, that's not scientific proof. But when you look at the whole political milieu that existed at that time, then you can't help but wonder if these things weren't connected.
And to touch real quickly on Jeff's point, we're down to just a couple minutes. Obviously, we'll talk to you in the coming weeks. Dr. Weck, the book is Cause of Death. If Sirhan had been drugged or had been hypnotized and all these things, and I know this sounds like a science fiction movie, is it possible that that has all been forgotten from his mind?
Well, yeah, sure. And I'm not a hypnotic expert, but as I understand it, there are forms of hypnosis which can make the individual completely forget about everything and anything that he did or said during the course of a hypnotic fugue. Oh yeah, that's well known. I don't think there's any question about that.
And for the viewers at home, just to let you know that to this day, the polka dot dress girl, as you know, if you read these books and go into the mystery, she's never been identified. Actually, there's been other pictures of her.
There was a real person. There's no question. I mean, this case cried out for investigation, which it never received then or since.
In our closing minute, Dr. Weck, I'm going to ask Jeff here as well. In your lifetime and my lifetime, and I know you're a pathologist, done thousands of autopsies, will we ever really know? Are there some files somewhere? Will we ever know what really happened? Well,
I used to be more optimistic. I'll give you my answer. And I used to say 30, maybe 20 years ago even, it was going to happen sometime in my lifetime. To be realistic and with great sadness, I must say it's unlikely that it will happen in my lifetime.
And I have to agree with the doctor.
It's going to take another 2-3 generations